Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. I think we all expected that Tamron would bring out a G2 version of their 17 to 28 millimeter at some point. Stands to reason. They had done that already with the 28 to 75 millimeter and then the 70 to 180 millimeter. But what I didn't expect was that they would not only bring out a G2 version with improved autofocus and features, but in this case, actually extend the zoom range on both ends of the spectrum. One of the main areas of advantage when Sigma brought out their own 16 to 28 millimeter was that it went just that little bit wider than what the Tamron did. That came at a cost. It was very heavy barrel distortion. However, it was able to go wider, and that was a factor. Tamron has really obliterated that advantage by not only going to the 16 millimeter on the wide end, but also extending out the telephoto end that extra couple of millimeters to 30 millimeters that might be just a little bit more useful. Now, not quite as useful as, say, the 16 to 35 millimeter of Sony's own G Master lens, but the Tamron is coming to market at $929 US, which is about $30 cheaper than what Sigma's lens is, and when you're comparing it to the G Master lens, it is well over $1,300 less. So that is going to obviously play to Tamron's advantage. But is this a lens that you should consider buying? I'm filming on it at the moment, and I'll film a few of these segments on it. If you don't see the lens on screen, I'm filming with it. And so we're going to dive in today and explore whether or not this is the major upgrade that we were hoping for, and whether or not it is the wide-angle zoom on either Sony E-mount or Nikon Z-mount that you should consider purchasing. We'll dive right into that right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off.
So in disclosure, this lens was loaned to me from Tamron USA. However, they have had no input on my review process. They will not see this review before you do. This is a completely independent review. So let's dive into it. I think the highlight thing that we need to discuss is the fact that we do have a definite improvement to the zoom range. So going to 16 millimeters, we now go as wide as 170 degrees, 2 feet, and then we go all the way into 71 degrees, 35 feet in terms of the overall framing here. So you can see that does make a fairly significant difference and gives you just more flexibility both on the wide end and on the telephoto end, and that certainly gives it some advantage. You know, it's still not as flexible a range as the 16 to 35 G Master, for example. However, definitely an improvement over the 17 to 28 and Sigma's own 16 to 28 millimeter. The price of $929 US is cheaper than the Sigma 16 to 28 millimeters by $30, but it's $1,360 cheaper than the 16 to 35 G Master Mark II. They have managed to increase the zoom range, increase the build quality, add some features, while really not increasing the size very much compared to the 17 to 28 millimeter. This lens is 74.8 millimeters in diameter. That's 1.8 millimeters wider, so just a tiny bit. It is 101.8 millimeters long, so that's 2.8 millimeters longer, so just a hair longer. And it weighs in at 440 grams, which is only 20 grams heavier than the 17 to 28 millimeter. So that makes it still slightly lighter than the Sigma 16 to 28 millimeter, and obviously it is lighter as well from the G Master lens. Tamron has really made it a priority to maintain a 67 millimeter front filter thread on the vast majority of their mirrorless lenses. That remains the case here, which means that you can share filters with a great variety of lenses, and obviously that's going to be incredibly useful. The design language is consistent with their G2 overall design, and it is a more sculpted, a little bit more elegant looking lens, and I appreciate the fact that it's not just like a flat barrel going out, but now we have sculpted sections. We have a little bit more standing out when it comes to the rings. It just feels like a little bit more premium design. The build quality is definitely improved as well. It feels a little bit more premium. And I will say this about these Tamron lenses. I've used a number of them for quite a number of years at this point, and I've had zero issues with them. They've actually held up really well. They don't feel like the most premium lenses in the class. Now in this case, comparing to the Sigma comes from their contemporary series, so it's not as nice as their Art series lenses. So I actually think this is the nicer build. But in some cases, Tamron lenses don't necessarily feel the best, but they do seem to be robust and they're holding up well. And I haven't heard anecdotal feedback of people that are complaining to me about any of these Tamron zoom lenses. I also find now that there is a consistent design language between the trinity of lenses, the now 16 to 30 millimeter, the 28 to 75 millimeter, and the 70 to 180 millimeter. You can see there's a consistent look across them. Now, this still isn't like a G Master level of features here. We don't have a dedicated aperture ring or anything like that. We do have a function or custom button here on the side. And then also there is a weather-sealed USB-C port on the side. Now that USB-C port is important because when it comes to Tamron, not only is that going to allow you to do firmware updates, but it really allows you to customize the lens in some ways that are pretty unique to Tamron. For one thing, instead of just relying on the function that you set to this button that applies to all lenses from within the camera, you can set a dedicated function in their lens utility software. And so in this case, it doesn't have an AF/MF switch. So for me, the thing that I like the best is being able to click that and just switch between AF/MF, on the fly. That's an option you can do, but there's quite a list of different things that you can set it up to do, some of which are not ordinary functions that you can program through that function button. Also, you have the ability to tweak the behavior of the manual focus ring, and so how far the focus is going to be, whether it's linear or non-linear. You actually get some ability to customize that, and so the lens works the way that you want. Again, I really appreciate that degree of customization, and of course then the ability to do quick firmware updates, always great. This lens is thoroughly weather sealed, not just at that USB-C port, but there are 8 different seal points throughout the lens, starting with the gasket at the lens mount and then throughout the different seal points. There is a fluorine coating on the front element, and so that obviously is going to help with fingerprints. It's going to help with moisture resistance there. I will also note that this is an internally focusing and zooming lens, and so the overall length never changes. The balance doesn't really change for putting it onto something like a gimbal. The manual focus feel is good. Again, you have the ability to tweak that behavior. The damping is good. It's not quite as heavy as what I would like. I would like a little bit heavier, but it is very smooth. It's very responsive, and so it does feel like a genuine manual focus simulation or experience. So I appreciate that. Inside, we have 9 rounded aperture blades. I've recently done a review of the Laowa 12mm F2.8. That lens only has 5 aperture blades and they are straight blades. I actually kind of like that approach on a wide angle lens because frankly, you're not going to have a lot of opportunities to create round specular highlights, particularly if you stop the lens down. The ability to create really nice sun stars, I think, is advantageous. In this case, it's an 18-bladed sun star. It doesn't look bad, don't get me wrong. It's not as pretty in my eye as what that 5-bladed aperture produces, so it all depends on your taste when it comes to that. Like many modern Tamron zooms, you have 2 different options when it comes to minimum focus distance. At 16 millimeters, you can focus as closely as 19 centimeters. At 30 millimeters, you can focus as closely as 30 centimeters. Your higher level of magnification is actually on the wide end. There you can get up to a 0.19 times level of magnification. Slightly better than the Sigma, not as good as what the G Master is. And I wouldn't say that it's as good up close as what the G Master is either. Probably not all that surprised by that. All told, however, this is a really nice little package. Comes with this lens hood, which bayonets on nicely. I do find, by the way, reversing it for storing seems to work better than it used to be with Tamron. Tamrons used to be really frustrating for some reason in reversing their hoods. That's not the case now, so steps in the right direction. This is a nice package and good value for money. So let's talk autofocus. Tamron has equipped this G2 version of the 16 to 30 millimeter with their VXD, which stands for Voice Coil Extreme Torque Drive lens. It is essentially their higher end, higher powered focus motor, and in this case, focus is pretty much instantaneous, whether I was shooting indoors or outdoors. It's a lot of thrust that's in this particular focus motor, and so it had no problem in pretty much instantly arriving at whatever I pointed the lens at. And so you won't have any issues with speed. You also won't have any issues with sound. It is essentially silent in operation. You might be able to hear the faintest whir if you put your ear right on the lens barrel, but frankly, who's doing that? Certainly not enough sound to ever be picked up by an onboard microphone. So certainly it is close enough to silent for actual real-world purpose. I also found that I had no problem in nailing in lower lighting situations. This shot, for example, I shot at night. It's backlit. It's not an easy situation, but focus locks right on, and when I zoomed in to 100%, it is accurately focused, and so it's doing a great job in a variety of lighting conditions. So when it comes to the autofocus speed and autofocus accuracy, any of those things, I have zero concerns. This is a great autofocus system for stills. So how about for video work? Well, a lot of the same truths for stills are also true here. You can see when it comes to doing my focus pull test back and forth that it does that smoothly. There's nice damping to it. It isn't just abruptly going back and forth, but there is a nice degree of damping there. Focus breathing, even at 30 millimeters, seems to be pretty well controlled, and so I didn't see a significant issue with that. Likewise, when I did my hand test, it did just fine in making that transition from my eye to my hand and back and forth, and so no issues there. I also found in real-world shooting, kind of real-world transitions, that those transitions were nicely damped and it didn't like abruptly jump from one to the other. And so again, for this kind of work, it's going to be a great lens. And I will note that it is going to be a very good lens to use on a gimbal, for example. It's pretty lightweight. It is internally zooming, and so regardless of what focal length you select, your balance point is going to be roughly the same with very little variation. And of course, the ability to have good autofocus that is not abrupt, low focus breathing is going to make it an asset for using on a gimbal. So a lot of great applications for video with the Tamron 16-30 G2. So how about the image quality? We have got a new optical design relative to the 17-28 millimeters, as you probably would expect. This is a little bit more complex. It's 16 elements in 12 groups. That includes 1 extra low dispersion element, 2 low dispersion elements, and 3 molded as spherical glass elements as a part of it. The optical design produces an MTF that looks good overall, though definitely with some variance between the center and the corners of the frame. The center looks really sharp, mid-frame looks good, then there is a pretty steep drop off to the corners. You see at 30 millimeters, it's more of a linear drop. Again, doing the same thing, however, it's getting sharper in the center and much softer in the corners. I was curious to line up the MTF from the 17-28 millimeter, and I found that while the overall optical signature is roughly similar, according to the MTF charts, the 17-28 millimeter is probably 1 to 2% sharper. Maybe not surprising in that it is a more constrained zoom range, and every time you go wider, that does come with some optical challenges. And so this is not a lens that you're going to buy because it's optically improved over its predecessor. You're going to buy it more because of the extra versatility that the zoom range and the functionality adds to it. Now, when it comes to vignette and distortion, I was a little afraid that going wider would really play havoc with the distortion because I knew with the Sigma has tons of barrel distortion. Fortunately, they've been able to mitigate that fairly well, and I'll give you some perspective on that in just a moment. There is some barrel distortion. It's about a +7 to correct, and it's not very linear. It leaves a bit of a mustache pattern when you just try to manually correct it. However, the Sigma, I went back and looked at results from the Sigma and the G Master Mark II from my test. The Sigma required, instead of a +7, a +21 to correct, and it still had mustache pattern. And the G Master was even worse, requiring a +24 to correct and still having some of that mustache pattern distortion. So while it's not perfect, it's definitely better than the competition when it comes to that metric. I also found the vignette wasn't bad. A +55 to correct at the 16 millimeter end. That's no big deal at all, about 2 stops. If you go to the 30 millimeter end, that distortion pattern has switched to a pincushion style distortion. It's significant. I needed a -10 to correct for it. That's comparable to the other lenses, or at least the Sigma. The G Master has a little bit less. The distortion pattern is more linear and corrects more easily. However, there's only a little bit of vignette at 30 millimeters. It required a plus 32 to correct, just a hair over a stop. And that is just very slightly more than what the G Master. And by the way, it's less vignette on both ends of the spectrum than what the Sigma lens had. Now, I'm testing on the Sony E-mount version. If you're using the Nikon Z-mount version, expect to see more of the vignette. I'm assuming that because it's been the case for every third-party lens that I've tested on both Sony and Nikon. They always have more vignette on Z-mount, and I think that's because of the wider diameter of the actual Z-mount itself. Now, Tamron does get good profile support on both of those brands, and so I found that it was no problem to correct the distortion when I plugged in the standard profile. And so at the end of the day, the distortion is not going to be a big deal, I don't think, for the average person. When I tested for chromatic aberrations, I found that there was very little to see in terms of longitudinal style chromatic aberration, a tiny bit of green fringing after the plane of focus, no big deal there, and almost no lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. That's kind of more the big deal to me when it comes to a wide angle lens, because it just means that you're going to get much cleaner performance near the edges of the frame. So those metrics, it performed well. When I did my real-world results using an A7R Mark V and 61 megapixels and looking at the results at 200% magnification, that's a torture test for any lens, I was actually really surprised by how well it did, even wide open at f2.8. I expected the center to look good, and it does. The mid-frame looks good as well, not as sharp as the center, but not far behind. But I was surprised that the corners still looked really quite good to me. And then when I stopped down to just f4, contrast improved across the frame, and now the corners are at really pretty excellent levels. And so that means that typical landscape apertures, real-world shots look really crisp all across the frame. 16mm performance I would consider to be actually very strong. Now, obviously, as you hit f11 and then f16, you're going to see some softening due to the effects of diffraction. That's physics, and you really can't beat it. Moving on to the middle of the zoom range, I found that it was very, very slightly less sharp, within 1 or 2% in the middle of the range. As before, though, I found that there is a significant amount of contrast boost, even in that little stop down from f2.8 to f4. By f4, results really looking quite excellent. And at landscape apertures, I was really pleased with the results I got. At 30 millimeters, the lens is a bit softer still, and just a little bit less contrast, and the corners look softer now. I did find that stopping down to f4, again, improved contrast. Contrast improves in the corners, but even if I stop further down to f5.6 or f8, they never get as sharp as what I saw earlier in the zoom range. However, taking a look at some real-world results, you can see here a comparison between f2.8 and f5.6, pretty near the edge of the frame, and frankly, it looks really quite good at f5.6. So again, I think for most people, it's going to be just fine. You don't buy a lens like this for the bokeh quality, but the bokeh quality isn't bad. You're not going to get strongly blurred out backgrounds, but the quality of the blur is quite decent. No major issue with that. And I found that that was true with a variety of different backgrounds. And so in general, I was neither thrilled nor disappointed. It's in that middle ground, but in a healthy part of the middle ground. More impressive, however, is the B-bar Mark II coatings that are on this lens. Did a great job in resisting flare. I think an improvement there, I would say, over the 17 to 28 millimeter, to where I really just didn't see any issue with either ghosting or with loss of contrast. It really did quite good when I was pointing it into the sun, which you're going to do far more often with a wide-angle lens. I wasn't able to get the kind of weather conditions where I could test coma in a traditional sense, shooting stars. However, I did shoot fireworks this year for Canada Day, and I found that near the edge of the frame, I didn't see any kind of weird things happening in terms of growing wings or becoming strongly distorted. And so if I look back again historically at the 17 to 28 millimeter, I would expect the results to be roughly similar. I did test for coma there, and I found only a minimal amount in the corners. I think the same is going to be true here. This should be a pretty decent astro lens because vignette is well controlled, and so you're not going to be dealing with extra noise from trying to boost the exposure in the edges of the frame due to that heavy amount of vignette that's just not present here. So overall, there's not really any kind of major flaw in the optical performance. It doesn't wow me necessarily, but it's really solid in all categories. So kudos to Tamron for increasing the zoom range here, getting a little bit more risky, and we really don't have to pay much of a price for it. So in conclusion, I would say that the Tamron 16-30mm F2.8 Di3 VXD G2 is certainly an intriguing option. I can't say that it necessarily wowed me in any particular way, but it also proved to be competent in all the areas that I tested. And when I look compared to the competition, I certainly would easily choose this lens over the Sigma 16-28mm. And I'm just not sure that it's worth the extra money to spend going all the way to the 2300 G Master lens. It's your money, of course, and there are areas where the G Master is still, I would say, the top-notch lens in this class. However, on the Sony side of things, I think that this lens probably makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. On the Nikon side of things, it may make even more sense because the real competing lens is actually Nikon's 17-28mm f2.8. And if you haven't figured that out, that's just really a rebranded version of the original Tamron 17-28mm lens. So this is a lens that actually has a lot of advantages over that one. And while that lens retails for about $1,300, this one is retailing for the $929. So it definitely has a price advantage there as well. I think that Tamron has done what it needs to do to not only update and improve this lens, but to make it a really compelling option that I think probably makes the most sense on either one of these platforms if you're looking for a wide-angle zoom that is high-performing but isn't going to break the bank. Now, if you want more information to back up that conclusion, you can take a look either at my text review that's linked in the description down below. There also is some buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, or you can stay tuned with me right now and we're going to jump into a deep dive of the optical performance. Let's jump into it together.
So first of all, we'll take a quick look here at the overall focal length. You can see that there's a pretty radical difference in the framing, even at close distances from 16mm to 30mm. As I zoom here in and out on the bridge, you can see what that difference looks like. Now moving on to vignette and distortion, you can see that the quantity of distortion is fairly mild here. You can see a bulge in the center of the frame. Some of the lines, out here are looking okay. Problem is that after correction, it does leave a mustache pattern behind, and so you can get the interior lines looking better, but not consistently good. Fortunately, the profile correction does better. To give you some perspective on that quantity of distortion, though, here is the Sigma 16-28mm. You can see just how much heavier the vignette is, but then also just how much more distortion there is compared to the Tamron. Likewise, here with the G Master lens, you can see also it has definitely more of that barrel distortion showing up there. And you can see here it's got a very strong mustache pattern as well. So while the Tamron in a vacuum doesn't look great, when you compare it to the competition at 16mm, looks pretty great. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you get a pronounced pincushion distortion. This is similar to the Sigma. The G Master is a little bit less at 35mm. You can also see here, looking at the right side, even with a manual correction, this is much more linear, much easier to correct. No big deal. Now, when it comes to longitudinal style chromatic aberration before and after the plane of focus, you can see a little bit of green fringing after the plane of focus. However, because there are so few real-world situations where you're going to get anything that's quite like this, I didn't notice it to be any kind of issue in real-world work. Likewise here, there is the tiniest bit of fringing that you can see right here on this most dominant black line, but that's about it, and this is at nearly 200% magnification. You will never see any kind of lateral style chromatic aberrations out in real-world shots, so that's great. So how about resolution and contrast? So this is a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V. We're zooming in all the way to 200% magnification. Center of the frame looks pretty close to flawless here. Great contrast, great detail, holding up really well. If we go up here towards the mid frame, mid is also looking very good. Slightly less contrast and detail, but still really at quite excellent levels. Now, if we work down this way and we go all the way towards the corner, the corner looks better than what I expected from the MTF chart. It feels like that I would be looking at that and saying that's a good, strong corner under normal circumstances. The opposite side looks good there. If I look down here, looking consistently good. I look up here, also looks consistently good. So overall, I feel like this is a really good wide open performance here at 16 millimeters. Now, for a little bit of context, let's take a look back to the Sigma 16mm F2.8. In the center of the frame, the two lenses look roughly similar. This Sigma may actually have a very, very slight edge when it comes to contrast there in the center of the frame. If we look here in the mid-frame zone, looks very, very similar. The Sigma looks a little bit different because it's darker, and so that does impact things. We move down towards the corner. We can see that the two results are somewhat similar, but the Tamron has a little bit more contrast and detail showing up here. And we can also see as we move towards edge of the frame, we compare here and here, that the Tamron holds on to its sharpness a little further out than what the Sigma does. Now, if we compare with the G Master lens at 16mm f2.8 on the right, we can see that the G Master arguably has a bit more contrast in the center of the frame. I feel like this writing here is looking a little bit better. We don't have an apples to apples comparison because I've updated the bills here. So let's take a look down in this zone, and you can see that I would say there's a little bit more contrast showing up for the G Master lens there. If we look at this area here, now I would say that it's roughly a draw between the two. And if we move down towards the corner of the frame, we can see that up till about this zone, they're roughly equal. As we move into this area here, however, the Tamron shows just a little bit more consistency right out to the edge of the frame. Popping over here to this left side, and we can see that I certainly like the feeling of the contrast better from the Tamron. And I would say even when it comes to the detail, they're close, but particularly the closer you get towards the side of the frame, I feel like the Tamron holds up just further out there, as you can see. For context, here's a real-world shot, and obviously not optimal conditions shooting in lower light, but we can see lots of detail even at 61 megapixels. And you can see as we get towards the edge of the frame, detail is holding off right to the edge of the frame. So overall, a really nice performance there. Now, if you stop the Tamron down to f4, I feel like contrast takes a pretty serious bump forward. And so any advantage that, for example, the G Master had by f4, I think the Tamron is very, very close there. We can see here in the mid frame, it is looking better. And I really noticed up in this corner that there's just definitely more pop by the time you get to f4. Contrast is brighter, detail is just sharper, looking really great even by that point. So that means by the time you get to landscape apertures like f5.6 here, even on 61 megapixels, tons of detail there in the center of the frame. As we move off towards the side, right here at the very edge, I would say that it looks better here than it does here, but it's still looking very good right off to the edge of the frame. Even if we can look at these edge areas here, even though they might be slightly impacted by depth of field, it's still all looking quite good. And so overall, this is a lens that's going to produce really stunning landscape images. Now, as per usual, diffraction is going to take a chunk out of contrast and detail. Starting at f11, it's softened a bit, but still perfectly acceptable. By f16, I would say it's still usable, but you can see it is just a little bit softer due to the effects of diffraction. Moving on towards the middle of the range here at 21 millimeters, I've got f2.8 on the left, f4 on the right. We punch in and look at the center of the frame. We can see that it looks good wide open, definitely more contrast. Stop down to f4, you can see that pop a little bit more there. That's true in the mid-range, and while I feel like it's close here in the mid-range, in the corners, it's close. I would say maybe a hair better at 16 millimeters than here, but overall, still a very good and very consistent performance, and certainly by the time you're hitting f4, you're at pretty excellent levels all across the frame. At 30 millimeters, again, f2.8 and then f4, the center of the frame feels very slightly softer to me, just a little bit lower contrast. You can see here. You can see that thus it makes a more marked improvement when you stop down to f4. I mean, look at the moire pattern emerging there, how much inkier the text looks there. Likewise, if we look off towards the mid-frame zone, you can see that, look at just the word Canada, for example, it's just much inkier looking at f4. And so stopping down definitely makes a big improvement. However, what I find here is that the corners never get quite as good as what they did at at other focal lengths. And so even here, if I put now f5.6 on the right, it's improved, but it's still not what I would consider to be excellent. I think it's going to be perfectly acceptable in real world shots, which we'll examine in just a moment, but it's just not as excellent as it was otherwise. Now, if we put that up compared to the Sigma at 28 millimeters, both of them at f2.8, the Tamron actually does have better detail in the center of the frame. I would say that the Sigma has better contrast. So it's a little bit of a give and take there. If we take a look at another common area here at the mid frame, again, there's definitely more detail there for the Tamron. Look at this figure, for example, how much more detail is rendered there. And out here at the edge, the Sigma has a better advantage at 30 millimeters. I would say that the 30 millimeter corners are the weakest part of the Tamron, but it's not by much of a difference either. Put it all in context at just a more typical 100% level magnification at 30 millimeters f2.8. We've determined this is weaker, but it still looks really great. Lots of detail showing up there. In this shot, however, if I put f2.8 on the left, f5.6 on the right, we can see that in the center of the frame, contrast is definitely kicked up. There's detail is improved, but it's primarily the contrast that has jumped ahead. But if we look over here closer to the side, you can see there's quite a bit of difference in the contrast that just shows up there. And so as we pan over to this side here, you can just see it looks richer, better contrast at f5.6. So at 30 millimeters, stop down a little bit and you're going to be into excellent zone in no time. So for a quick comparison, here is the maximum magnification you can get at 30 centimeters, which is about 0.14 times, and then what you can get at 16 millimeters, which is a 0.19 times of magnification. You can also probably make out here, and we'll zoom in a bit, that you're also going to get better contrast and detail on the wide end. I don't love when lenses are oriented like this because it is harder to get really close at a wide angle, but you can see that you're definitely going to get the preferred results. And it also shows that difference in contrast, at least wide open, between 16 millimeters and 30 millimeters. Now, as far as the bokeh quality, again, you don't buy a lens like this for the bokeh necessarily. You can also see that, again, contrast isn't top-notch at f2.8 at 30 millimeters. However, you can see looking at the quality of the blur, even though this scene's fairly complex, it doesn't look too bad. This, a more advantageous type situation, we can see that, there's pretty decent detail and contrast in the leaf here, but as we look towards the background, it looks fairly soft, really. And here at a very close distance, we can see detail looking actually pretty good, and then the quality of the blur, it's not strongly blurred out, but the quality of the blur itself is fine. Here's another shot, and this kind of helps us with the transition towards our actual flare resistance as well. But you can see again that even in a backlit situation like this, quality of the bokeh looks pretty decent. So here is a look at a wider aperture here at flare resistance. You can see no ghosting, no loss of contrast. Stopping on down, you can see as we work that towards the corner, a little bit of a ghosting pattern here, but quite minimal for an f11 type shot. Here with a more central composition at f11, you don't see any of that ghosting pattern there. So flare resistance overall is really quite good. Now, again, it's not as easy with something like this to examine what I'm looking for when it comes to coma performance because everything is in a state of movement. But what I'm really looking at is, are we starting to grow kind of those wings at the side? What I see is a little bit of stretching, but what I don't see is growing any kind of wings. And so while this isn't my favorite way to test for coma as compared to what I might normally do, it looks like overall that the Tamron is doing a pretty decent job here without growing any kind of wings, and so not too much coma.
Well, thanks for sticking around to the very end, and I hope that this has given you the information that you need to make an informed decision. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.